It began with a soldier who wasn't really missing a night patrol, a routine drill, a shot fired maybe by mistake, maybe not. And from that single moment of confusion, near an old stone bridge on the outskirts of Beijing, the bloodiest war in Asia since the Mongol conquest erupted into history, this was not how world wars were supposed to begin. Not from a skirmish, not from a bridge, but in the darkness of the 7th of July, 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge, or Lugu Chao in Chinese Japanese, and Chinese troops exchanged gunfire in a tense standoff. Within hours, it was already more than a misunderstanding. Within weeks, it was all-out war. And within months, the war would consume cities, burn across provinces, and tear apart families by the millions. The world called it the Second Sino-Japanese War. But this wasn't just China's war. Behind the clash loomed the shadows of Stalin and Hitler, Roosevelt and Hirohito, in the ashes of Nanjing, and the smog of Shanghai. The outlines of World War II in Asia were being drawn long before Pearl Harbor, and far from the European battlefields we remember so vividly. And so we ask not just what happened, but why? Why did this bridge matter? Why did a nation with a fractured military resist a global power like Japan? And why, in the face of atrocities that stunned the world, did no one step in? The story of 1937 is the story of resistance, of tragedy, of international blindness, and of a bridge that burned far more than stone. By 1937, the powder keg had been sitting for years, hissing and simmering beneath Asia's fragile post-war peace. 6 years earlier, in 1931, Japan had invaded and occupied Manchuria, a vast, resource-rich region of northeastern China. The invasion had been swift and, from the world's perspective, shocking, but the League of Nations offered only words, not consequences. Japan left the League. No one followed. By 1932, Japan had established the puppet state of Manchukuo, with the last Qing Emperor Puyi installed as a figurehead. The world moved on. Japan didn't stop. Meanwhile, China, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek and his Nationalist Party, was struggling to unify a fractured republic. Regional warlords still held sway over large swaths of the country. And even worse, Chiang faced a growing communist insurgency under Mao Zedong. Civil war smoldered under the surface. Japan watched, waited, and prepared. So when Japanese forces stationed near Beijing began conducting night maneuvers near the Marco Polo Bridge, it was hardly unusual. But this time, they didn't inform the Chinese garrison nearby. Tensions were high. At some point during the drill, a Japanese soldier didn't report back, fearing foul play. The Japanese commander, Colonel Renya Mutaguchi, demanded entry into the Chinese-controlled town of Wanping to search for him. The Chinese refused. Shots rang out. The missing soldier returned unharmed, but it no longer mattered. Mutaguchi ordered artillery strikes. Reinforcements poured in, and within days, Japan declared it an incident. A familiar word, one they had used for Manchuria, one that now hid a declaration of war. The China incident was underway, but Chiang Kai-shek hesitated. He'd seen this before in 1931. Back then, China had done nothing. The international community had done nothing. Japan had kept Manchuria. Now, China's military was still weak. Its government divided. Chiang's advisors urged caution. One of them, Shu Yongchang, warned, if war breaks out, regardless of whether or not a third country intervenes, at best, both sides will lose. But something had changed. The loss of Manchuria had been humiliating, The Chinese people were angry, and Chiang, once determined to crush the communists first, now saw Japan as the greater threat. This time, China would fight. In the north, Japanese forces quickly overran key areas including Beijing, Tianjin, and Shanxi. With a better equipped army, superior air power, and naval dominance, Japan seemed unstoppable. By late July, they had more than 600,000 troops in China. China's military was numerically larger, over 8 million men, but only a fraction were well trained. The rest were regional militias, warlord armies, or communist fighters with outdated weapons. China was not united, but it was defiant. Chiang made a bold move. He opened a new front in Shanghai, China's international city home to Western consulates, foreign troops, and global media. It was a move designed to draw Japan into a costly urban battle and perhaps even provoke Western intervention. On the 13th of August, fighting erupted. What followed was one of the largest and most brutal battles of the early war. Nearly 1 million troops would be involved, 250,000 Japanese, 750,000 Chinese. Airstrikes leveled city blocks. Naval bombardments shattered the Bund. The Chinese tried to bomb a Japanese cruiser, but accidentally struck the international settlement, killing over 1,000 civilians in what became known as Black Saturday. A reporter wrote, "Flames from a blazing car played over distorted bodies in shapeless heaps where they'd been huddling in shelter. Hands, legs, arms lay far from smashed masses of flesh. Still, Chinese forces, many trained by German advisors, held fast. Japan responded with poison gas and amphibious landings. The battle dragged into November, house by house, block by block. But ultimately, the Chinese lines broke. Japan captured Shanghai, but at staggering cost. Tens of thousands of their best troops were dead, and China had proven it would not go down easily. In Nanjing, the nationalist capital, Chiang faced a decision: stand and fight or retreat. Against the advice of his generals and German military advisor Alexander von Falkenhausen, Chiang chose to make a stand. Nanjing had been more than a capital for Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party. It symbolized a new China, a vision of order, strength, and modernity rising from the ruins of imperial collapse. Wide avenues, stately government buildings, and the towering mausoleum of Sunday Yat-sen, father of the Chinese Republic, stood as proof that China could rebuild. But in late 1937, Nanjing stood alone. The Chinese army defending it numbered around 75,000 men under General Tang Shengji. But morale was low. Discipline had frayed. Many troops were under-equipped. Some lacked shoes. Some had never even fired a rifle. Only a handful, roughly 20,000, had seen real battle. General Matsui Iwane, the Japanese commander in the region, initially intended to bypass Nanjing and head west, but intelligence reports suggested the city was ripe for the taking, undermanned, unready, politically exposed. And so, in December, the decision was made: Nanjing would fall. On the 5th of December, Japan launched a full-scale assault. By the 8th, the outer defenses had collapsed. Chiang Kai-shek had already fled the city for Chongqing. Now declared the provisional capital, Chinese forces torched supply depots and bridges as they retreated, using scorched earth tactics to slow the Japanese, but it barely worked. By the 10th, the second line of defenses had fallen, and on the 12th of December, Japanese troops stormed the city walls. Within hours, the city descended into panic. General Tang ordered a full retreat without notifying all units. Soldiers stripped off their uniforms to avoid capture. Thousands rushed to the riverbanks, trying to escape across the Yangtze, mixing with civilians and creating scenes of chaos. People trampled one another in the crush to board overcrowded ferries or makeshift rafts. Many drowned. The Japanese army entered a city without order, and then they began to destroy it. The massacre that followed, known as the Rape of Nanjing, remains one of the darkest chapters in modern warfare. For 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers looted, tortured, raped, and murdered civilians and surrendered soldiers alike. The numbers are staggering. Between 100,000 and 300,000 people were killed. An estimated 20,000 women and even boys were raped, many in front of family members. Entire households were wiped out. Victims were mutilated, beheaded, set on fire. One Japanese soldier wrote in his diary, "Climbing atop the mountain of corpses, I felt like a real devil slayer. Groans, there were old folks, as well as kids, but we killed them. Locked, stock and barrel." The justification: Chinese soldiers had abandoned their uniforms. In the eyes of many Japanese officers, any male civilian might be an enemy combatant. The deeper reason: a combination of indoctrination, racism, and military culture. Japanese troops were trained with brutality, often beaten by their own officers. They were taught to regard the Chinese as subhuman, that Japan was destined to rule Asia. That mercy was weakness. That war had no rules. A Japanese officer, Ryukichi Tanaka, told a journalist, "To be perfectly frank, the ways you and I look at the Chinese are fundamentally different. You seem to think of them as human. I see them as pigs." The horror was not hidden. Western journalists and missionaries in the international settlement, a so-called safe zone in the city, saw it unfold firsthand. One of them was John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi Party member. Ironically, his affiliation with Germany, Japan's ally, gave him limited protection. He tried to stop the violence. He wrote letters to Hitler. He documented atrocities in his diary, begging the world to intervene. They did not. During the chaos, several foreign nationals attempted to flee. Among them were American citizens and diplomats, boarding the USS Panay, a U.S. Navy gunboat anchored in the Yangtze River, alongside 3 oil tankers operated by Standard Oil. On the 12th of December, Japanese aircraft bombed and strafed the ships despite clear U.S. Navy markings. 2 American sailors and several civilians died. It could have been a cause for war, but it wasn't. Japan apologized. They called it a mistake. They paid $2 million in indemnities, and the United States, not yet ready for confrontation, accepted the apology. The world moved on. Nanjing did not. By January 1938, Japan had taken the capital, but it had also ignited an international backlash. What was once a war of conquest was now a war of attrition and public opinion. Even among Japanese generals, there were regrets. General Matsui, upon entering Nanjing and seeing the devastation, was said to be visibly shaken. But the machine of war had no brakes. Japan had chosen escalation, and for China, the worst was still to come. The fall of Nanjing was meant to end the war. It didn't. If anything, it transformed what Japan called a China incident into a sprawling war of resistance. Chiang Kai-shek had gambled and lost the capital, but the psychological impact, both domestic and international, had been enormous. For the Chinese people, the scale of Japanese brutality had erased any illusions. There would be no appeasement, no coexistence, no compromise. This was now a war for survival. Chiang retreated inland to Wuhan, then to Chongqing, a mountainous city far from Japan's supply lines and protected by the rugged terrain of central China. From here, he would coordinate a long and grinding resistance. The Kuomintang would rule from Chongqing for the rest of the war, and something remarkable happened. The same warlords who once resisted Chiang's authority now rallied behind him. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, joined the fight in what became known as the Second United Front. This uneasy alliance between communist and nationalist, bitter enemies just months earlier, now shared a common goal: to drive out the invader. Public opinion hardened. The atrocities of Nanjing flooded Chinese newspapers and radio broadcasts. Popular slogans emerged: China cannot be lost. Resist to the end. Even the national anthem would change. The March of the Volunteers, first heard in 1935, surged in popularity as a defiant call to arms. Meanwhile, in the international community, whispers turned into murmurs. Although the United States and Britain still hesitated to intervene, the Soviet Union acted. In August 1937, the Sino-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact was signed. Stalin, though wary of Chiang Kai-shek, understood the strategic threat posed by Japan. By backing China, the Soviets could bog down Japan and protect their eastern flank. That year alone, the Soviets sent 450 military pilots, 1,500 advisors, and thousands of tons of equipment, including tanks, trucks, and aircraft. Germany, ironically, pulled in the other direction. Though they had trained many of Chiang's elite divisions, Berlin began tilting toward Tokyo in its global strategy, joining the anti-Comintern pact against the Soviet Union. By 1938, German military aid to China began to dry up. But it didn't matter. The war had become ideological. Japan claimed to be liberating Asia from Western imperialism, but in practice, it was carving out its own empire by fire and bayonet. And despite victory after victory, Japan's problem was becoming clear. They had taken cities, but not control. The Japanese military was among the most formidable in the world, trained, disciplined, and heavily armed, but geography, population, and resistance soon became their greatest enemies. China was too vast. By early 1938, Japan controlled most of China's northeast and eastern seaboard, but inland, their grip was tenuous at best. Guerrilla attacks by communist and nationalist forces cut off supply lines. Entire provinces became ungovernable. Japan had deployed over 600,000 troops, and more would follow. But to garrison every city, protect every railway, and secure every road required millions. And Tokyo didn't have them. In the rural interior, Chinese forces regrouped. Communist troops, now backed by the Soviets, launched ambushes and sabotage raids. Nationalist armies rebuilt and rearmed with Soviet equipment. Even civilians joined militias. By mid-1938, Japan was spending nearly 90% of its national budget on the war in China. And it wasn't enough. They were bogged down. The war they thought would last a few months had no end in sight. Still, Tokyo doubled down. Rather than seek peace, Japanese generals met in January 1938 to decide the next steps. The conclusion: escalate, occupy more, break China's resistance through sheer destruction. But the more Japan burned, the stronger China's will became. As 1938 unfolded, Japan turned its gaze to a new target: Wuhan. The city, nestled at the confluence of the Yangtze and Han rivers, had become China's temporary capital, a political and logistical hub brimming with refugees, factories, and ammunition depots. But capturing Wuhan, Japan hoped to decapitate the Chinese resistance once and for all. But the battle for Wuhan would prove anything but easy. Beginning in June 1938, Japanese forces pushed south and west, pressing into the heart of China. The Chinese, determined not to lose another capital, prepared fiercely. A new kind of resistance emerged, better coordinated, more disciplined, and now drawing from hardened veterans of Shanghai and Nanjing. Still, the Japanese juggernaut advanced in desperation. Chiang Kai-shek ordered one of the most controversial acts of the entire war, the deliberate destruction of the Yellow River dikes near Zhengzhou, unleashing massive floods in an effort to halt the Japanese advance. The strategy worked militarily for a time. Japanese troops were stalled, but the human cost was catastrophic. Over 500,000 civilians drowned or starved in the flood's aftermath. 3 million were displaced. In the name of national survival, Chiang had sacrificed his own people. To many, it was an act of brutal necessity. To others, a horrific betrayal. But it underscored a central truth of the conflict. There were no easy choices, only survival or extinction. Wuhan fell in October 1938, but again, not easily. The defense lasted over 4 months, exhausting Japanese forces and dragging Tokyo deeper into an already overburdened war. Victory was Pyrrhic, and China, wounded but alive, still refused to break. Outside China, the world watched with growing unease. In Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt condemned Japanese aggression, quietly increasing aid to the Chinese. American volunteers, pilots, and mechanics began to trickle into the Chinese Air Force. In London, officials feared that Japan's ambitions might destabilize British colonies in Asia, especially Hong Kong, Burma, and Singapore. But it was in Moscow that real decisions were being made. By 1939, the Soviet Union had become China's lifeline. Soviet aircraft dominated the Chinese skies. Tanks, engineers, and advisors turned China's interior into a defensible bastion. Skirmishes even broke out between Soviet and Japanese forces along the Manchurian-Mongolian border, most notably at Lake Khasan and Halkhin Gol. These battles were not just sideshows, they were crucial. They convinced Stalin to pursue a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939, hoping to keep his eastern flank quiet while he prepared for war in Europe. And for Japan, the message was clear: avoid war with Russia. Focus on the south. It was a fateful pivot. Instead of pushing further into Mongolia or Siberia, Japan looked to Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, and ultimately, Pearl Harbor. By 1939, the war in China had reached a stalemate. Japan controlled much of the eastern coastline, major ports, and key rail lines, but the vast interior remained in Chinese hands. The nationalists ruled from Chongqing, the communists expanded in the rural north, and the resistance grew fiercer each year. Japan's army was overstretched, its economy strained, its people tired, and yet the empire pushed on. Guerrilla warfare intensified. Chinese agents sabotaged railways, bombed supply depots, and assassinated collaborators. In response, Japan deployed 3 alls tactics: kill all, burn all, loot all, a scorched earth policy that devastated entire regions, but it backfired. Rather than subdue China, it radicalized it. Every massacre, every razed village, every public execution drove more people into the arms of resistance. Even as Japan built puppet governments like Wang Jingwei's reorganized national government in Nanjing, they never gained true legitimacy. China, broken and bleeding, refused to bow, and in that defiance, it became the first front in the coming global war. China's struggle in the early years of the Second Sino-Japanese War is often overshadowed by the thunderous headlines of Europe's descent into chaos in 1939. But long before Hitler invaded Poland, long before Allied tanks rolled through North Africa or day was even imagined, China had already been bleeding for over 2 years. It had become the first battlefield of World War II in Asia, and as historian Rana Mitter argued, China was the first Allied power to stand against the Axis, but it was standing alone. By 1940, Japan had failed to subdue China, but it had turned the eastern half of the country into a wasteland. The Chinese economy was in ruins. Famine crept in the shadows. Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang government struggled to maintain unity and supply. Even worse, the fragile united front between Chiang and Mao Zedong began to crumble. As the nationalists retreated westward, the communists expanded their base in the countryside, winning over peasants through land reforms, education, and disciplined military action. Their influence in rural China surged, and with every passing year, it became clear, while Chiang's armies held the cities, it was Mao's guerrillas who were winning the hearts of millions. The war had two fronts, one against Japan and one waiting to ignite between two Chinas. But first, a greater war would arrive. On the 7th of December, 1941, Japanese bombers struck Pearl Harbor, and within hours, Japanese forces surged into Malaya, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Burma. The Pacific was ablaze. And just like that, China was no longer fighting alone. The United States declared war, Britain followed, and suddenly, Chiang Kai-shek found himself at the diplomatic table, not as a desperate underdog, but as a recognized Allied leader. The China-Burma-India theater was born. American advisors arrived. General Joseph Stilwell, famously prickly and blunt, began reorganizing Chinese forces and building a supply route over the Himalayas, the Hump, to bring in Allied aid. Stilwell famously called Chiang Peanut, a reflection of both frustration and the fragile alliance between the two. But whatever the frictions, aid began to flow. China's resistance, once seen as doomed, now became essential. Every Japanese soldier tied down in China was one less fighting in the Pacific. Every Chinese counterattack bought time for the Allies to prepare island invasions. Even American media joined in. The film The Battle of China, produced by Frank Capra in 1944, depicted the Chinese as heroic underdogs, a nation rising from its knees to resist tyranny. Propaganda, yes, but also, finally, recognition. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, China lay in ruins. Over 20 million Chinese civilians and soldiers were dead. More than 80 million had become refugees. Entire provinces were depopulated, cities reduced to rubble, and an entire generation scarred by violence, starvation, and occupation. But it had survived, and survival for China was its own kind of victory. Yet peace would not last long. The fragile alliance between the Kuomintang and the communists collapsed into civil war within months of Japan's defeat. The weapons that had been used against foreign invaders now turned inward. The battle for China's soul resumed more brutal than ever. By 1949, Mao Zedong had seized power. The People's Republic of China was born. Chiang fled to Taiwan. The Cold War had begun, and the world forgot or chose to forget how it all started. History rarely gives clear answers, but 1937, the spark that became an inferno, offers something darker and more difficult. A mirror. Why did the world not act? How could a rising empire commit mass atrocities in broad daylight and face almost no consequences? The massacre at Nanjing was reported in real time. Letters were written, photographs smuggled, diaries kept, and yet no intervention came. The international community hesitated. The League of Nations was toothless. The United States clung to isolation. Britain had its own empire to worry about, and so Japan, unchecked, plunged deeper into brutality. It's tempting to view this as a uniquely distant horror, something that belongs to another century, but the mechanics of atrocity, the calculated dehumanization of a people, the political inertia of world powers, the chilling belief that might makes, right? These are not relics. They are symptoms still alive. At the core of the Second Sino-Japanese War was a collision of two worldviews. One believed in imperial hierarchy. The other, though fractured and weak, clung to sovereignty. And when these collided, the outcome was not diplomacy. It was annihilation. But China did not vanish. In surviving, it changed. The war hardened the communists. It exposed the corruption and rigidity of the Kuomintang. It pushed China onto the world stage, not as a passive victim, but as a nation shaped by resistance, trauma, and endurance. The echoes are still with us. In modern China's sense of grievance, in Japan's historical debates, in the strained diplomacy that still flares between these ancient rivals, in the stories of survivors who lived to see their grandchildren but never forgot the bridge, or the fire, or the silence, in the textbooks of the West, the Second World War begins in 1939, with the invasion of Poland, but in Asia, the road to World War begins in 1937. And in truth, even earlier in the cold mountains of Manchuria in 1931, China's war was not just a subplot. It was a global hinge. Japan's failure to conquer China outright pulled Tokyo into new campaigns in Southeast Asia. That escalation drew in the United States. That brought Pearl Harbor, and with it, the full global war. None of it happens, not in the same way without the stalemate in China. And yet, in popular memory, the sacrifices of millions are barely footnotes. Perhaps it is because there were no dramatic landings, no Churchillian speeches, no photographs of liberation, only scorched villages, fleeing peasants, and a resistance that, though fractured, refused to die. In truth, China fought longer than any other allied power in World War II. It bled in silence and shaped the century without ever truly telling the world its story. The Marco Polo Bridge still stands today. Its arches stretch across the Yongding River, worn with age, shadowed by time. Tourists visit. Some take photos, some barely glance. Few know that here, on a humid night in July 1937, a single shot, a missing soldier, a mistranslated order unleashed a war that would engulf a continent and redefine a civilization. It did not begin with a declaration. It began with silence, confusion, and a decision not to step back. China would never be the same. Neither would Japan. And neither would the world. In a way, the war still burns. This has been a production of Legacy Files because history is not a timeline. It is a warning. If you found this story meaningful, Consider subscribing to Legacy Files to explore more hidden chapters of history, the ones that cost blood, but rarely make the front page